What's up, nerds? Ukraine is still struggling with mobilization, and this is a huge problem that we're going to go ahead and talk about and try to discuss why this is happening. Time is running out. They're facing acute shell shortages all across the front line, and they're increasingly outnumbered by Russian forces. We're also going to talk about how Russia has addressed mobilization and how this is actually increasing the gap between the Russian military and the Ukrainian military, and that's becoming a bigger problem. Now, the gap between Russia and Ukraine will continue to widen until this issue has been addressed. Now, I want to acknowledge here up front that I'm not Ukrainian, all right? I'm trying to discuss here a pretty complicated issue within Ukraine, a politically contentious issue here in Ukraine, while not being Ukrainian. So just take, what I say with that acknowledgement. Mobilization will have a dramatic impact on Ukraine long term that we're going to discuss. Not only economically, but demographically. It's a huge conversation right now. And really why the mobilization bill that's pending right now within their parliament has not yet been passed. I'm speaking about this situation as an American, just analyzing the situation from the outside looking in, not advocating for any position. So, let's approach this complicated conversation analytically and objectively. Now, there's a growing problem with mobilized troops that has not been addressed yet. That's happened really since the start of the war. These mobilized troops that were mobilized at the beginning of the war have seen continuous fighting for over 2 years now, continued the entire time, and some pretty high intensity fighting as well. Those that have been mobilized, if they're not physically injured, then they've likely faced some sort of psychological injury. However, that being said, Ukraine cannot afford to pull these soldiers off of the front line. There's not enough men behind them. If they are pulled from the front line, they need troops of equal number at least to go to the defensive positions that those troops are being pulled off from, we're at, to make sure that the defense posture is the same. They just don't have that right now. And many of the troops that they do have behind those frontline soldiers don't have sufficient training. Now, there has been, NATO training programs to help give these troops training. However, again, that training program is slightly abbreviated. And I say slightly abbreviated. It's pretty abbreviated because there's just not enough time. They've got to get these troops into service quickly. A lot of these troops go for just a couple to about a month or so long of training. Some of them might get 2 months of training, and then they're sent to the front line. As a comparison, though, most NATO forces will have months-long training programs for their combat forces. Some of them can be 6 to 8 months, sometimes longer, depending on the job that they have. For instance, here in the United States, you'll go to basic training for about 3-ish months, and then, if you're infantry, you'll go to an infantry school for another few months. Then there's other kinds of, that's just, the basic lessons of those roles. That's the basic training for those roles. If you're wanting to go airborne, there's still airborne school on top of that. There's still other kinds of schools that you'll need to go to as well. Now that's where training can be a bit of a problem, especially with trying to rotate forces. And this is where the mobilization bill comes in, because really there's an acute need in Ukraine to get more bodies in uniform. That will provide relief for those that have been mobilized from the start of the war, to get some kind of rotation, to be able to get some rest from the war, to recover. It will also give Ukraine the ability to form and reform new combat units that can launch an offensive sometime in 2025 potentially. However, that being said, the idea that Ukraine can launch an offensive, that's really going to be if they are given more Western support. Organically right now, I don't assess that they can really pull that off, especially this year. Now, the need for manpower in Ukraine is pretty substantial. The Russian force, by comparison, has actually grown since the war began, growing from over 360,000 troops at the start of the war to over 470 troops right now in Ukraine. That's an increase by around 15%. There's also a comment by U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell assessing that Russia has almost completely reconstituted its military. Now, that statement really it kind of contradicts the assessments of the Pentagon as well as multiple other NATO allies. I think from a manpower perspective, I can kind of see where he's coming from, because yes, they've grown their force in Ukraine. They've been able to get more people in uniform. So from a manpower, like a numerical perspective, I see where he's coming from. Yesterday, we talked about Russian equipment losses and how they're struggling with equipment shortages, and how over time that's going to manifest itself even more. That's not necessarily something we're seeing Russia has tanks, and they will have tanks for some time. But at some point, given their current rate of consumption versus their rate of production, that's going to become a challenge for them later on, in a couple of years perhaps. However, manpower is not an area where they're having that kind of challenge. So from a firepower perspective, I think you're going to be hard pressed to say that Russia has reconstituted its military. They've suffered substantial equipment losses. They've had to draw from their Soviet inheritance in a pretty substantial way. And that's going to take years, maybe even decades, perhaps, at least, when building and rebuilding out that Soviet inheritance. It's going to take a very long time for them to be able to regenerate that strength. Years just to get, the kind of active combat power that they had at the start of the war. But again, if we're just looking at this from a numbers perspective, and from a, not looking at quality. So not looking at quality of training, not looking at quality of professionalism, not looking at quality of equipment. If we're looking at, okay, they have X number of tanks and they have X number of troops, you could see that maybe they have to some degree reconstituted. But again, that's not really how we look at militaries. We look at it in a more holistic fashion. So I'm just going to state that there. However, I will say that in a war of attrition, the amount of personnel that you have varies intensely. So that very much is, an important number that we're looking at here, and something that Ukraine has to look at in terms of mobilization. Now, some of the Russian growth has actually been attributed to their own mobilization and how they've kind of sustained mobilization over the years. They've increased the mobilization age from 27 to 30, and that has actually unlocked a whole pool of up to 2 million Russians that are now eligible for service. That's a pretty substantial number just with that small change. Russia likely won't face the kinds of manpower changes that Ukraine is facing simply because their population is so huge. And they have so many different levers to pull to get people in uniform, different kinds of economic incentives, different kinds of, legally they can just enforce people to get into uniform. I'd say the challenge for Russia is more about equipment quality and lack of competent leadership. But again, we've already talked about that in this video, and really we talked about that more in yesterday's video, so I would encourage you to check that out, and I'll have that linked at the end of this video as well. Now, the challenges facing Ukraine are as great as ever right now in terms of mobilization and in terms of the military situation as well. And Ukraine has to do something to address it, period. They cannot continue to just sit and twiddle their thumbs. It's really more a question of how are they going to go about it. Zelensky recently passed a bill lowering the mobilization age from 27 to 25. Now, you might notice that that's kind of the inverse of what we just said with Russia. For instance, Russia increased their mobilization age from 27 to 30, meaning they're drawing on younger populations to fight. Ukraine is actually drawing on older populations. And we're going to talk about that here in just one moment. But one of Zelensky's changes also included scrapping of some draft exemptions. The change of the mobilization age should increase the pool of people that Ukraine can recruit by around 50,000 more soldiers. And that sounds like a very small number. There's roughly around 500,000 Ukrainian men in that age range from 25 to 27. However, a lot of them are medically exempt. A lot of them may have left Ukraine, and a lot of them may already be in the reserves. And so they're exempt from mobilization because they're already in uniform technically. So that really whittles that 500,000, Ukrainian number down to just 50. So that's something to consider. But as of right now, kind of talking about the age, right? Ukraine's kind of going in an inverse mobilization format, and that plays a key kind of role in why mobilization is so complicated. The average age right now in the Ukrainian military is somewhere in the 40s. And this is because Ukraine is trying to protect younger generations from fighting. And that's because they simply demographically, they have less younger Ukrainians. And this is a challenge that we're seeing worldwide. Most countries in the world are dealing with aging, demographics, aging populations, smaller, younger populations that are having less children. Well, the same story is true in Ukraine. And, if enough, younger Ukrainians are killed in the fighting, then Ukraine could ultimately later face a demographic crisis where the population declines rapidly. And so this leaves Ukraine in a catch-22 situation. You either mobilize more younger men or you risk them being killed. And in later years, less Ukrainians are born and the population shrinks drastically. Now, for example, we've already kind of seen this since the war began. In fact, with the war, there's been a drop in new births in Ukraine by 32%. That's a pretty significant drop. Now, on the opposite end of that, catch-22, you do not mobilize the younger men. Frontline troops do not get the relief that they need, and ultimately losses and exhaustion continue to compound over time, and Russia continues to mobilize on their end. They continue to generate, manpower strength. And then the slow creeping offensive that we've seen from Russia, over the past several months continues to gain traction until in a year or two, they ultimately are able to put Ukraine in a situation where they have to negotiate on Russian terms for an end to the war. Now, another key element to this mobilization bill is around the topic of demobilization, which is basically allowing those that have been fighting on the front line and basically mobilized in this conflict for 2 years to return home and leave the military, be demobilized. This would include a sizable portion of their current overall military force, and it would require, again, more troops behind them to be able to take their place. Kiev has scrapped this resolution, and this has led to some controversy as well in Ukraine. The reality is that right now there are not enough soldiers in Ukraine and in Ukrainian military service to be able to take their place. So they cannot afford to have rotational deployments right now. The troops that they're mobilizing, they're being put on the front, and they have to remain on the front until the war is over, which is an incredibly tough ask of any person, especially when this is the most high-intensity conflict that we've seen since World War II. And this is hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians that are being put in this situation, and it's for years on end. They'll likely have to remain in position until a larger mobilization can be completed and until those soldiers are trained up and prepared to go to the front to relieve them, basically. Now, on this topic of rotation, let's talk about that because it's really important. You need to get your troops rotated. You need to give the troops that have been, in the fight for a prolonged period of time a break, some time to kind of catch your breath, let the unit reconstitute some strength, and let it, reconsolidate and then go back, to the fighting rejuvenated. It is incredibly hard to do. I think, we here in the United States, we kind of take it for granted because we just had, 20 years on the war on terror, and we saw rotational deployments done very, that it became a science. The military is very good at doing those kinds of things, but it's still very hard to do, especially in an active war as intense as what we're seeing in Ukraine. It requires a lot of coordination between these different units to hand off these battle positions to prevent any kind of decline in the overall defense posture. You want to make sure that the enemy can't exploit a rotation in the units and gain some sort of a breakthrough. It's a very, it's a critical moment in the overall deployment whenever you are handing off a position to another unit. And so that can be very challenging. Now, I mentioned that the U.S. was able to do this over 20 years during the War on Terror, but that's a completely different situation. The fighting was way less intense, and the U.S. has way more forces that it can lean on to be able to have these kinds of rotational deployments. We have to think, in this case with Ukraine, we have to think more from the mindset of like World War II, where troops were there in theater for years. And they had some time that they were able to kind of rotate and get a little bit of a break, but those breaks lasted for weeks to maybe a month or two, but they still didn't go home. They might have individually had a pass to go home, but the unit itself remained in theater. It reconstituted its strength, and then it was quickly redeployed back to the front. The concept of deployment, it wasn't around these, models of a year-long deployment or a year-and-a-half-long deployment, which might get extended occasionally, but, ultimately there is a date that another unit's going to come in and take your place. This was it's all hands on deck, and everybody's staying in theater and fighting until the war is won and the job is done. This is kind of the situation that Ukraine is in right now, except they don't have the kinds of manpower pools or, military sizes or strengths that like the U.S. has to pull on. So it's got the troops in place right now on the front line. They're becoming increasingly more exhausted and worn down due to the fighting, and they don't really have any backfill. And this is the highest intensity fighting that Europe has seen since World War II. Now, there is a lesson here, I think, for Americans watching this, because I think that we often forget, because of those 20 years in the War on Terror, what we're in for, really, if we're in a war with a near-peer adversary. This is the kind of situation that we're going to be looking at. It's not going to be those year-and-a-half long, rotations into, a combat theater where you get rotated back out. It's going to be where you're in for the war, pretty much. You're in for the duration. It's goodbye rotational deployments. Hello long-term, war duration long deployments. terms and restrictions may apply. Now, the United States and Russia can't afford to have those kinds of rotational deployments because we've both got massive militaries, massive economies, and massive populations that can all handle and sustain those kinds of things. Ukraine does not have those luxuries. When it comes to mobilization, the strain on putting people in service is much more acute in Ukraine because they just don't have the population to be able to accommodate these kinds of massive policy changes to get massive amounts of people into uniform, potentially, killed or wounded, that could impact, not only the economy long term, but the population long term. And this is why it's become so challenging for Ukraine to pass a new mobilization law. You either risk your country disappearing because it was conquered by another one, or you risk it disappearing because you fended off that other one. But in doing so, so many of your young people died that your population had a significant decline over years. And then eventually it's not what it used to be. Even if Ukraine wins today, they win this war and they push Russia back, you have to wonder whether or not in 20 or 30 years, Russia comes back knocking. And then because Ukraine mobilized today, they won't be able to mobilize tomorrow. Now, with all that, I want to hear your thoughts on this because, again, it's a very complicated topic. I'm pretty sure there are some details here that I might have missed here. So I want to hear your thoughts and insights on this topic. It's interesting. Subscribe for more analysis, not only on the war in Ukraine, but also on other conflicts as they come up. We're also covering the war in the Middle East. And like this video if you found it helpful or informative. I'll see you all next time. Later.